And our guest for today is Robert Klee, who is speaking to us about confronting the climate crisis with clean energy policy, a look at the federal, state, and local level. Robert Klee is a lecturer at the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale Law School. He teaches courses on energy and environmental law and policy with a focus on the role of subnational actors, that's states, cities, companies, and institutions. Outside of Yale, Rob is principal of Klee Sustainability Advisors, LLC. That's a consulting firm that advises clients on strategic, legal, and regulatory issues surrounding clean energy deployment and sustainable materials management. Prior to his work at Yale, Rob was commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. He was a lawyer in private practice and a law clerk for 2 federal judges. He holds a PhD from Yale School of the Environment in specializing in industrial ecology. He also holds a law degree from Yale and an undergraduate degree from Princeton in geology and environmental science. We will not hold the Princeton affiliation against him. Rob lives with his family in Woodbridge, Connecticut, where he is the chair of the town's Planning and Zoning Commission. And he also serves on the advisory boards of the Audubon, Connecticut, and the Trust for Public Land in Connecticut. Welcome, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really a treat to have you here today.
Lauren, thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants and for sharing kind of who you are and where you're from. I actually recognized a few names in there as well, which was is a treat for me, particularly in the folks who are in the financing and deploying clean energy group. But it's also nice to see other neighbors here in Connecticut, but also from around the world. This is a really exciting time to be talking about climate change. And so I hope to really talk in your and hear from you through your questions, which I encourage you to submit all throughout the more lecture part of our time together. Submit your questions into the question and answer function on Zoom. And I'd love to get to as many of those as possible at the end of our time together. So keep them coming as I go. I'm a pro at this now. I've done Zoom teaching for, I did it for 1.5 years. We're now back live and in person, and it is actually wonderful to be back live amongst the students at Yale. So I want to jump in today and sort of start with just a caveat that you're going to hear from my perspectives today. As Lauren mentioned, I'm a former state commissioner in Connecticut, part of the executive branch, the implementation branch, no offense to those in the legislative branch. I'm a current lecturer. I'm a scientist and I like experiments. I'm a lawyer, so I like laws and policy. I'm also a dad and I like my kids and I hope they're not embarrassed by me. They're reaching that age where that happens more often than not. But most of all, I recognize that these issues of climate are issues about future generations and the things we do today to leave a world that they will inherit that is capable of sustaining them in the ways that we have experienced during our generations. So today I'm going to talk about the case for action, which resonates now here in the US more than ever. The search for a coherent federal clean energy policy. It may be hard to find, particularly on the coherent side of federal clean energy policy. Then I'm going to spend some time and make a case for states and other subnational actors like cities and companies and institutions, including like Yale and Harvard, and maybe Princeton. I don't know if I'm allowed to say Princeton around here. I also will offer a sampling of the lessons we can learn from innovative policies at those subnational levels that might be able to be scaled up and go national. And then I want to have as an opportunity at the end to talk about what's literally happening this past week, whether over in Glasgow or in the last few weeks with the Biden administration and their attempts to pass federal climate policy. So I want to get your questions teed up about that. We can explore that topic together. So for this audience, I'm pretty sure I don't have to spend a long time convincing you that the climate crisis is serious, though you know that in just August of 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their 6th assessment report, which had the latest updates on the science of climate change, and it paints a fairly stark picture. Climate change has already begun and is already causing significant changes to our climate system that we basically cannot undo. My morning's Twitter feed included the loss likely of the glaciers on Kilimanjaro, which are now nearing to the point where they're almost disappeared. This latest IPCC report points the finger directly at us, at human activity and our gargantuan, quote unquote, gargantuan output of greenhouse gases as the cause. And what's new in this report is the willingness of scientists to attribute so many of the changes at the global and regional levels to human influence, and really have a better sense of where we are headed based on the different emissions pathways that we may follow. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 degree report from just October 2018 implored all of us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from all parts of our economy and society on the order of 40 to 60% by 2030. Those numbers are important. That's why the Biden administration's goal is 50% reductions by 2030 if we want the planet to stay at a manageable 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. We can debate at the end whether that ship has sailed or not, whether we've lost the ability to actually hit the 1.5 degree mark. Though the world will not end in 10 years, which was some of the kind of coverage coming out of that report, the choices we make in the next decade, particularly on clean energy deployment, will be critical for determining the long-term habitability of the planet. So this one's another 1,500-page report. This one's by 13 federal agencies, our 4th national climate assessment, also from 2018, really described in detail the trouble we're already having dealing with the upheaval baked into the climate system. For the Northeast, where I live, the report highlights the impacts to the water systems, energy systems, transportation systems, from severe storms, drought, heat waves, flooding. It's kind of the all of the above challenges. And you've heard this sort of before, I'm sure, that the 7 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 7 years. And 2020 basically tied 2016 for the hottest year on record. The year 2020 saw 22 weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion, whether they were droughts or severe storms or cyclones or wildfires. By the way, for those of you who were part of Isaias and the fact that we lost power in Connecticut for about a week, that didn't even make the billion-dollar list. So Isaias was just a minor event in this calculus. The first 9 months of 2021 had 18 separate billion-dollar weather events. And these disasters have already exceeded the economic cost of what happened in 2020. There's been about $2 trillion worth of these types of billion-dollar events since 1980, and the costs of inaction are large and they're clearly rising. And the images of our changed climate are now really front and center. They're on the news, they're in our social media feeds, and likewise. They're more so part of our culture and consciousness. The impacts are also hitting us close to home. This happens to be Cozy Beach over in East Haven, and when I was in grad school here at Yale, I lived just down the road from where this happened. This happened to be damage from Superstorm Sandy in 2012. I know that this year, many have seen the Texas near failure of their electric grid, or the rolling blackouts in California because utilities had to shut off the power. But to bring it closer to my home, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, during the height of Tropical Storm Irene, rising tides came within less than 10 inches of overtopping 3 of their coastal substations, which they had to de-energize. They basically shut off power to 50,000 relatively low-income customers in Bridgeport. If the saltwater got into that equipment, they may have been out of power for weeks, if not months. So again, this is the vulnerability. We're literally living on the edge with much of our critical infrastructure. But there's also the daily and sort of monthly challenges that we're experiencing due to climate. The roads in your community that may flood twice a month, not because it's raining, but because it's high tide and the sea level has risen enough so that there's that flooding. Or the things we're experiencing in our backyards as the shifting seasons are experienced in my backyard tomato garden, which was very robust this very wet and long growing season this summer. Part of what we're seeing as well, though, is a shift in attitudes. And I'm going to give a shout out to some of the great work done by colleagues at the Yale program on climate communication and their work tracking the 6 Americas with respect to climate: the dismissive, the doubtful, the disengaged, the cautious, the concerned, and the alarmed. In the last 5 years, the number of people who are alarmed by climate change more than doubled. And now more than half the country are concerned or alarmed about climate change, and the doubtful and dismissive have dropped down to below 20%. So the direction here is clear, that we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as we can, as fast as we can, in order to avoid fundamentally altering the planet in ways that we may not be able to adapt to. But we must also still adapt to the impacts that we're already seeing and will continue to see for decades to come due to that warmth that's already baked into our climate system. So my question for all of you, and why you hopefully came to hear my talk today, is do you think the federal government is up to this task? Or to put it another way, does the US have a coherent federal clean energy policy? And I'll put an emphasis on the word clean, because we have a lot of energy policy. I would argue that it's not necessarily clean energy policy. So to answer that question, I'm going to take us on a 130-year sprint, hopefully in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So buckle up. And obviously, there'll be plenty of time for questions or to go deeper into any of these topics. But I'm going to run through all these sort of key milestones. As you'll see when I'm talking, I have intentionally chosen federal laws and policies that still influence and shape our US energy policy today, and some of them date back to the 1870s. As I go through my material, I hope you'll also see that there's some general policy tools in the federal government toolkit on energy policy, like investments in research and development, investments in large-scale infrastructure, subsidies, tax policy, mandates. But ask yourself, has the federal government taken a consistent approach to clean energy policy? Well, let's take a look. So let's begin at the beginning, the Industrial Revolution, and I enjoyed seeing a fellow geology major in the chat. That was my geology undergrad. My love of the environment actually came out of Rocks for Jocks when I was a freshman at that other school in New Jersey that sent me to all these places out west to experience the natural wonders of our Western United States. But during this time period, it was of Western expansion, of increased geologic knowledge and exploration and exploitation, frankly, of resources. And the image here is from the California coast right near Santa Barbara. So this was up into the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, large oil development. This, I think, were actually some of the first technically offshore oil rigs because they were built out on piers hundreds of yards out into the water. Hard to believe that is now a tourist destination today. But I want to talk about the General Mining Act of 1872, an act that's still largely intact today, that established the general federal policy that, quote, all valuable mineral deposits in the lands belonging to the United States shall be free and open to exploration and purchase. So anyone who found anything of value on federal lands could comply with some pretty basic requirements and pay $5 an acre to get the rights to exploit them. That $5 per acre still applies today, unchanged since 1872. Now, the folks in Washington soon realized that the oil, gas, and coal deposits on federal lands were quickly coming into private hands, and they were a little worried that the federal government was going to have to buy them back from all these private entities that have now taken the federal resources. And therefore, Washington passed the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 to ensure that there was a system, an orderly system for the exploration and exploitation of oil, gas, and coal on federal lands. A company seeking to extract those resources pay some upfront fees, and then they pay the federal government a royalty of 1/8 of the value, the revenue that they get from the sale of their mineral resources. That 12.5% or 1/8 royalty has been unchanged basically for 100 years. So that's where we are literally giving it away. Those royalty payments, not only are they sort of given away to the private entity, but they are then redistributed in the following manner, where half of those federal royalties go back to the state in which the minerals were extracted. Alaska has an even better deal. They get 90% of the federal royalties come back to Alaska. 40% goes to a reclamation fund that does water and irrigation projects, mostly in the Western US, and the Treasury only keeps 10%. Now, notice how the federal government basically pays half the royalties back to the states in which the minerals were extracted. So as you might guess, this creates states that are very dependent on those revenues. So in 2020, federal mineral royalties in Wyoming totaled about $900 million of federal royalty payments to Wyoming, or about 25% of their general fund budget. You might guess that they are not in favor of government moratoriums on drilling on federal lands because so much of their budget is tied to it. So from the 1920s, let's jump to the 1930s and the time of the Great Depression, where the federal government decided to get involved and invested in large-scale energy generation and improving access to electricity as part of their goals of putting people back to work as part of the New Deal. And the Public Works Administration was one of the lead agencies or entities involved there. And they created some of our iconic massive infrastructure projects, like this picture by Ansel Adams of the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Don't forget, however, about the Tennessee Valley Authority, which similarly was created to develop and bring energy and economic development to some of the country's most impoverished areas at the time in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The TVA was granted the authority to acquire lands along the Tennessee River, build dams, and set the baseline prices for what it costs to generate electricity to serve as a check against rising power prices from private companies. So by 1934, there were over 9,000 people employed by the TVA, and they built 16 hydro dams on the Tennessee Valley between 1933 and 1944. The last major piece of investment here, of public investment, was the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. This is part of the challenge of this time period where there were basically two Americas, that there was farms that were basically not part of the electrification that had been happening in urban areas, where urban dwellers had access to lights and water and radios and the sort of modern technology. But on the farm, life was fairly miserable without that access to electricity. So in 36, the Rural Electrification Administration spent $420 million over the next 10 years to bring electricity and electric power everywhere. And by the mid-1950s, only 20 years after the New Deal, 97% of farmers were connected to central power stations. So this is a moment in time with huge federal investment in energy generation and transmission that frankly forms the backbone of our national energy grid today, and was probably some of the largest investments in that grid over the intervening 70 years. And these large hydro dams are the backbone of our baseload zero carbon energy from those investments now so long ago. So alongside those New Deal era investments in infrastructure was a new regulatory system that began with the Federal Power Act of 1935, which created the new Federal Power Commission, the precursor to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It arose in response to the new proliferation of interstate transmission lines and a desire to ensure that wholesale power, sales, and transmission were offered at rates that were just and reasonable and non-discriminatory. That was the regulatory compact that the Federal Power Act and the Federal Power Commission was charged with. Similarly, in this sort of 1930s era, there in the trust busting sort of the time, there was the breakup of large utility holding companies into the types of utilities we now see today. This is the origins of utilities that tend to either be located in one state only, or if they're located in two states, they have the connection geographically, so they're a contained area. This is also a time when those utility companies then had to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission to, again, bring them under regulation. So this is, again, these are foundational parts of our regulatory structure that exists today on why we have utilities that are structured as they are. Jumping ahead to the atomic age, after World War II, the federal government was encouraging the development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And this is an example where the federal government was willing to heavily invest in research and development, which they still do, in new energy technologies. And they created the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946, which eventually became the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for that purpose, to really get research on how nuclear power could be harnessed for commercial use. The picture here is from Shippingport, Pennsylvania. It was these two cooling towers are part of their two more recent nuclear power plants. The original one from 1957 is located in the lower right-hand corner and it's not powered. It stopped to generate power, I think, in the early 80s. Along that same time was the Price-Anderson Act of 1957. And this is an act that's been updated all the way through till today that provides financial protection to nuclear power plant owners by basically limiting their liability. So if there was a major accident that occurred at any one of our nuclear power plants, the owners of nuclear power plants have to buy insurance for up to the first $375 million in liability. Then amongst the 100 existing nuclear power plants, they have a pooled liability for an additional $125 million. But anything over that, and if you can imagine that a nuclear disaster would have more than $500 million of damages, all of that is covered by the federal government as a backstop. So this is, again, a different policy tool by liability relief or liability limitation that enables nuclear reactors to operate, because they're basically not on the hook for the unfortunate, if there was an unfortunate disaster. I told you this was going to be a fast tour, and I know folks want to get to what the states are doing, and I'm almost there. But I do want to recognize the oil shocks, which was, and mostly to give a shout out to this picture, which was a gas line in December of 1973, about a month before I was born. And my parents tell the story of them having to make sure there was gas in the car in case I arrived early, and they hoped that I arrived either on an odd day or an even day. I couldn't remember. I can't remember which one, to make sure there's enough gas for my mom to get to the hospital. But out of that sort of recognition of the challenges and our vulnerability to global oil markets came two foundational federal energy policies. One, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, that brought us our first efficiency measures and the first introduction of the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit and the corporate average fuel economy standards that tried to get manufacturers of cars to create more fuel-efficient cars. The second thing that came out of this was the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978. And I apologize, in the world of energy and environmental law and policy, there are way, way too many acronyms. The PURPA, as it's called, recognized that utilities, which were at the time vertically integrated, could actually buy power from independent producers that was cheaper than what it cost them to produce it on their own. And PURPA was a way to basically make that an option, to allow utilities to start actually looking for lower cost power. It turned out that renewable energy, even in this sort of early stage, was cheaper than particularly the oil-fired power plants that were suffering from the oil shocks of the 70s. California really took advantage of this and brought online over 12,000 megawatts of renewable generation capacity, because those state regulators in California really aggressively used PURPA. And this was the first step towards the deregulation of our energy system. Now I want to talk about briefly the Energy Policy Act of '92. We're fast forwarding into the 90s, about the time when I was about to go to college. The end of the first Bush administration, this was a congressional act that on the clean energy side created the first comprehensive federal incentives for energy conservation in buildings through new building codes and new efficiency standards for appliances. It also had the first provisions for low flow toilets, which the former guy got real upset about. The act also was the origin of our renewable energy production tax credit, which still exists today. Congress also wanted to drive alternative fuels into vehicles and was looking for incentives for reducing our dependence on foreign oil and transportation. A lot of this was where corn-based ethanol got into our gasoline mix, but there also were natural gas vehicles, biodiesel vehicles, and hydrogen electric vehicles, even in the early 90s. Now, of course, the Energy Policy Act of 92, and the next one I'll talk about, also had lots of language on increasing domestic supplies of oil and gas. And I know already in the chat that there's questions or the Q&As on fossil fuel subsidies. There's a whole lot of them in these Energy Policy Acts that are designed to increase our oil recovery. There are incentives for fracking and for going after shale gas as well, plus plenty of provisions on clean coal and coal usage. But this one also has sections on healthcare for mine workers that were affected by black lung disease. The last thing is that this set the foundation for the broader utility deregulation that we saw in the 1990s and the creation of private wholesale electricity generation markets and sort of breaking up utilities into electric utilities that are just distributing, sending the power to your homes, separate from different private merchant generators of power, all in the markets controlled by FERC and the regional transmission organizations. In 2005, during George W. Bush's administration, Congress passed another Energy Policy Act. And again, here there were expanded incentives for efficiency, for appliances, the extension of the renewable production tax credit, the creation of the new renewable investment tax credit. These are two tax credits that still exist today and were a part of the conversation with the Biden administration about supporting the deployment of renewables. This was also one of the origins of finance as a mechanism to deploy clean energy and the creation of the federal loan guarantee program. And this was a recognition that commercial lenders were often unwilling to invest in new technology, particularly new clean energy technology, before it was fully proven. And the federal government could take on that risk by providing these loan guarantees to help those first movers establish that, yes, they are real, they can operate at scale, and allow the private capital markets to catch up once the technology has proven itself out. And that's a theme that you'll see emerging later on when we talk about green banks as well. Now, again, as usual, this is a federal energy policy. There were plenty of incentives for oil and gas and clean coal, just like in 92. And some helped expedite the environmental review of oil and gas exploration on public lands. Plus, there was the infamous Dick Cheney and Halliburton loophole that exempted fracking fluids from the environmental regulations of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Superfund law. So fracking fluid got a pass from all of our basic federal environmental laws. The last thing is that it brought new responsibilities for FERC. And FERC, largely in response to two main sort of incidents, the blackout in the Northeast in 2003, when I happened to be living in New York City at the time and had to walk down a whole lot of flights of stairs when the blackout hit. And so new responsibilities to oversee the reliability of our transmission grid. And FERC also had new tools and penalty authorities to prevent market manipulation in response to, you might guess it, the Enron scandal of 2001. Beware that a lot of the policies that we make are often in response to scandal, to events, and we are a very reactive sort of policy-making entities. Speaking of that, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 was in reaction to the Great Recession. Here, about $90 billion, or about 11% of the ERA funds went to green activities for clean energy. Now, to put that in context, China's investment in their stimulus to get out of the Great Recession invested $220 billion in clean energy, about 40% of their stimulus money. South Korea invested $30 billion, but that was 80% of their stimulus money in green initiatives. And as you might now not be so surprised, China and South Korea are now some of the major global producers of things like solar panels, which are essential for our clean energy deployment. But back to the US, there were $5 billion for weatherization. There was the federal government saying we're going to lead by example because the federal government is the largest employer and the largest property owner and asset manager in the country. So they invested in greening the federal buildings and improving the efficiency of the federal vehicle fleet. There was $11 billion for transmission projects to bring windy areas, places where terrestrial wind, to load centers and development of the smart grid as well. And the ARRA really supersized that loan guarantee program. And although Solyndra and its $500 million loan failure got all the press, there were plenty of large and very successful loan guarantees under ARRA that supported more than $40 billion in renewable energy investments and deployments. Those loan guarantees helped build the world's largest wind farm and half a dozen of the world's largest solar arrays. And as many people will tell you, that getting to those economies of scale and demonstrating that those clean energy technologies work at scale is one of the main reasons why those $90 billion invested on ARRA has really ushered in the steepening decline in the cost of renewables. A few other items, those production tax credits and investment tax credits. At the time of recession, no one actually were making any money to actually take advantage of the tax credits. So they turned some of those credits into grant programs from the Treasury to keep those investments in renewables going. And last two, ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, got a $400 million investment of capital, which really was about promoting the cutting edge research and development and getting those new technologies out to market. The ARRA also helped motorists retire their old gas guzzling vehicles, the clunkers, but it was also a backdoor way to help bail out the auto industry by encouraging people to buy new cars, which were more efficient. There was also a deal done as well that in order to take the bailout, the auto companies had to agree to really deploy cleaner and more efficient cars as well. Whew. Okay, so that was the quick tour of what's at the federal level. And I think many of you will probably have seen a theme emerge there that Washington seems to suffer from a codependent or toxic relationship with fossil fuels. They just can't quit them. And the real action on clean energy, I argue, is happening at the state and local level. States, they're a microcosm of functioning government and society, and they currently, that doesn't really exist, I argue, in Washington, but they're still at a reasonable enough and significant enough scale to be real and to be relevant to the nation as a whole. Similarly, cities and companies and institutions, including our academic institutions, are functioning better, I would argue, than many other places. They tend not to be hyper-partisan. Now, don't want to be Pollyannish here. There is politics and partisanship at all levels, but they seem to at least function slightly better than Washington. And states and cities are a level of government that is closer to the people who are actually feeling the real impacts of our overheated climate. And then when you add them up, states, cities, companies can be a force to be reckoned with. And particularly at a time when the federal government is having a challenge of actually standing up to the fossil fuel industry and others, these entities have stepped up. And collectively, our subnational actors who have committed to meaningful climate action represent about 70% of the US GDP, almost 2/3 of the US population, and more than half of our US emissions. If they were a country, these we're still in group of subnational actors would be the world's second largest economy, larger than China and second only to the entire United States itself. So here's an opportunity for the Biden administration, I would argue, to really find partners in these subnational actors and look to them on how to get stuff done. So they're a force to be reckoned with. They've done the experiments. I'm a scientist and a lawyer, and one of my favorite Supreme Court quotes is from Justice Brandeis in a case from the 30s called New State Ice Company versus Liebman, where Brandeis described how a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. And this is the origin of the phrase that the states are the laboratories of democracy. So they've run experiments on what a economy-wide deep decarbonization would look like, it looks a little bit like this picture, which is the implosion of the last coal-fired power plant in Massachusetts to make way for a new offshore wind assembly hub and an interconnection point for the offshore clean energy to bring it onto the New England grid. So how are they doing it? I offer sort of 3 examples in the world of targets, in innovation, and in mobilization of capital. So starting with targets, a key part of the story is how subnational actors have basically established new rules and mandates for how they're going to deploy clean energy. And part of that transformation starts with the public utility commissions, the regulators of our electric systems. And the mission traditionally for public utility commissions has been to regulate in the public interest, which for decades and decades, back to the 1930s, frankly, has been defined by delivering affordable, safe, and reliable power to all customers. That's what the public interest means. Now, in states like Colorado, Massachusetts, Maine, and others, legislatures are saying to the Public Utility Commission, your mission also includes the deployment of clean energy, the meeting of our state's climate goals, and addressing environmental justice and energy justice issues. So imagine if at the federal level, the FERC had not just the mission of delivering safe, reliable power, but clean power or addressing injustices. That would be a very different Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Relatedly, those legislatures are also telling their utility commissions and their utilities, guess what? We want more clean energy, just a mandate. Just you have to have whatever is coming out of the plugs that are currently powering the screen that I'm operating with. 30 states in the District of Columbia, which covers about almost 60% of retail electric sales, have either a renewable portfolio standard or a clean energy standard that says all the power that's coming out of your outlets has to have a certain percentage, often increasing over time, of zero carbon power. And that mandates have been updated recently in Washington State, in Illinois, Virginia, have interesting models. And we'll talk about the Biden administration's attempt at the end, hopefully, to include a clean energy standard in the Build Back Better framework. So the states are also innovating, and they're innovating in updating what the grid looks like, which unfortunately doesn't look a whole lot different than when Thomas Edison had their Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, which was built in 1882. Large power plants far away send their power to your homes in one direction. But states and cities are beginning to realize that their homes can be an integral part of this new distributed clean energy future. When your rooftop is generating energy, a battery in your basement is storing it. Your major appliances are all connected via your smartphone to know when to turn on and when to turn off to meet the different rates depending on the time of use. This is an exciting and brave new world, which I think my undergraduates and definitely my kids are all prepared for, considering how much time they spend on their phones. I'm a little more circumspect, having grown up with the Terminator movies and the Matrix movies, concerned a bit about that level of control, but this is a radical departure from where things were before. And some states are really embracing that electrified home future. California in particular is basically requiring by building code that all new homes have solar panels, battery storage, are ready for an EV charger, and now have heat pumps instead of natural gas furnaces for heating and cooling. Utilities are going to obviously play a key role in this new world, and innovative utilities are finding creative solutions like the one pictured here from Vermont, where Vermont's Green Mountain Power has partnered with Tesla to deploy 2,000 grid-connected Tesla Powerwalls in homes all across Vermont. When the batteries are there, they are often paired with solar, and they normally just sort of charge from the solar and then discharge at night. When storms hit, they're there as battery backup. But for the utility and for the grid operator, at the hazy, hot, and humid summer days, the utility can take control of these batteries and use them as a virtual power plant to avoid turning on a very expensive and very dirty peaking power plant, and instead just use these 2,000 batteries in people's homes. And in doing so, in the first month that they had done it, Vermont saved about $500,000 the first time they turned on all their batteries and $1 million the next time they turned on all their batteries. So these types of investments, turns out that they can pay for themselves as well. So I want to talk money, and I want to make sure we get to your questions. So I will have just a few more slides before we get to your questions. And the importance of capital and the insignificant amount of financial investment to make sure that we can solve the climate crisis. This is going to be an interesting part of the conversation. Now, the government spends a lot, but it can spend better. And private investors actually have the ability to spend more and invest more if they're interested and comfortable in the clean energy space. So innovation is now happening in making sure that the private capital flows are heading into the deployment of clean energy at scale. Because public budgets are going to be tight. That's what we know. I knew from my time in public service. So to deploy clean energy, you really need to figure out how to unlock private capital. And that's one thing that Connecticut has led the way on in innovation through green banks. And these are quasi-public organizations that take a little bit of public money and use that to leverage private investment by de-risking, kind of like those federal loan guarantees, but at a broader and wider sort of scale, de-risking investments in clean energy development. And Connecticut alone has taken in its first 5 years of operation, $200 million in ratepayer funds to generate $1 billion in investment in the state in clean energy and efficiency, creating tens of thousands of green jobs along the way. Similar green banks have showed up in Maryland and New York, and they're now going international. And it's really an interesting new sort of public and private partnership model. It's also in part of the Biden administration's Build Back Better approach. And then leading companies. And here's an example from Microsoft that are aggressively charging ahead with their own greenhouse gas targets, their own renewable energy purchases through power purchase agreements, and their own internal voluntary targets to go carbon neutral, carbon negative, and really invest in a clean energy future. And what's interesting is that the Microsofts and Googles and Apples and one, we can debate over some elements of them. On this line, I'm actually going to cheer them on that they've been actively seeking out clean energy to the point where they're showing up in states that don't traditionally have utility commissions or others that are interested in clean energy deployment, and they're demanding it. They're saying it is part of their requirements to build that new data center or that new operation. They want to make sure that it's powered by clean energy. So they're moving very old and crusty utility commissions to behave better and to act differently. I think there's also a recognition amongst companies and institutions of large employers that to attract and retain the best talent, they have to demonstrate leadership on a whole lot of things, and climate and clean energy is often one of those things as well. So that's where I wanted to give a shout out and a plug. It's so great to have some members of our financing and deploying clean energy cohort on the event today. That role of finance is so important and so exciting, and so much stuff is happening that the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, or CBAE, has launched the Financing and Deploying Clean Energy Certificate Program. So this is a joint venture between the Yale School of Management and the Yale School of Environment that is really made for and with clean energy professionals who are working in this space and want to learn more about how they can accelerate the deployment of clean energy. On the slide, you'll see some of the details of the topics that we cover. I cover the policy segment, but it really goes into the technology, the finance course, and really talks about innovation in this space. And there's a ton of great sort of Yale faculty experts many may have heard of, like Dan Esty, who I think has done a talk in this series, Dan Gross, Richard Kaufman, Ken Gillingham, Paul Sabin, Narasimha Rao, Mike Orstaglio. And we also bring in outside experts as well. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you'll have these slides and these links. Check it out. The admissions process is going to launch soon. My last topic before we get to your Q&A, and I thank everyone for hanging on with me, is one that's actually near and dear to my heart, and it addresses a common critique that clean energy is only for the wealthy. And that's something that states have realized is a problem, and a problem in particular because the decarbonized clean energy future must really be for everyone and must not add more burdens to those who are already burdened by more than their fair share. And here in Connecticut, we saw early on, and I was on the board of the Connecticut Green Bank, that our residential solar was easy to do in wealthy communities like Westport and West Hartford and Woodbridge. And it's much harder to do in Waterbury or in Bridgeport or in Hartford or even in parts of New Haven. So in the early days of our residential solar program, 80% of the new residential solar installations were going to our wealthy communities, and only 20% were going to low and moderate income communities. And those are the communities that are suffering from energy burden, where they're spending between 6 and 15% of their household income on their energy bills, and where the savings that comes from clean energy would truly benefit those folks. So the Green Bank tried to solve the problem with their Solar for All program. So first of all, in this world of incentives here for going solar, they decided to give 3 times the normal incentive if you were in a low and moderate income customer. Then the Green Bank partnered with a for-profit entity called Posigen, who had creative ways of financing solar and energy efficiency in the low and moderate income space, largely because they had a different underwriting criteria. They weren't actually focused on credit scores. It's proprietary, but they were looking at your ability to repay your bills and other sorts of things that allowed them to offer solar leases that would save money, have little down or nothing down for the customer. They also hired locally and had their own sort of folks who have gone through and gone solar with them as their own brand ambassadors. And through these and other efforts, in just 6 years, our solar installation sort of universe is now on rough parity, where half of the installations in Connecticut go to low and moderate income communities and half go to communities that are wealthier. And that's been, we're one of the few states to achieve those levels of deployment, and is a model for others as well. So I would argue that now's the time to go national. I've only really scratched the surface, and I want to make sure I get to all your questions, which I've already seen coming through the chat, and there are some challenging ones for me there. So we're going to have fun with those. I think there are some strong caveats. Obviously, some of these examples are from states that are on the coast, or they are from states that generally have bipartisan support on issues of environment and climate action, which is different than what we see at the federal government. But we're still seeing in Midwestern and mountain states like Colorado, like Illinois, some significant efforts to address climate change. And back to our friends at the Yale program on climate communication, this is actually a reflection of where the country is going. There are, their survey work, which I really highly recommend people dive into, show that people want to and are supportive of policies that regulate CO2 or have a carbon tax, or that give tax rebates for electric vehicles or solar, or require utilities to get some percentage of their energy from new renewables. So this is a moment in time which I think is interesting for us to sort of grab onto that sentiment in the broader public and their interest in deploying clean energy and addressing the climate crisis. So hopefully I've made the case for action, that this is serious, we need to do something. Hopefully you have a sense of federal clean energy policy and how it's been inconsistent over time, that we'll talk about whether the Biden administration is trying to make that more consistent. I've hopefully made a case that states and local governments have examples of effective clean energy policy that could go to scale. And now I want to end my sort of formal conversation and go to your questions and put up some other things that I'm happy to talk about as well with respect to the Biden administration and their deployment. But before I do, I just wanted to thank all of you for the participation today, and I am now excited. I see in the chat, I see in the Q&A, and I see, Lauren, we have lots of great questions to go.
Yeah, we've already got quite a vibrant discussion going on, and I really enjoy it when people talk to each other in the chat, because you all bring such a wealth of experience and knowledge that that sometimes the dynamic conversation in the chat is is the most interesting thing going on in these presentations. We have quite a few questions. If you have questions that you would like me to read live, please do put them in the Q&A box. That allows me to keep track of the order that questions were asked and to make sure I get to as many of them as I can. I actually have a question I want to start with that was sent in prior to this presentation by Scott. And I'm bringing this question to you, Rob, because I thought you did such a nice job of setting up your presentation by going through some of the history of U.S. energy policy. Scott goes to the 1930s period, and he asks why the North American raw temperature record, which clearly demonstrates that the 30s were the warmest decade on record. As historians understand, he said, historians have dubbed it the Dust Bowl, etc. And there is no discernible warming trend in the past 20 years. And yet it's repeatedly, the raw temperature record is repeatedly adjusted by the NOAA using an algorithm that cools the 1930s and other warmer older years and increases the temperature measurements of recent years to produce more warming. And I hope that makes sense. Scott's sort of challenging the idea that we've had more warming in recent years than we did in the 1930s.
So it's an interesting question, a challenge to NOAA as well, which I'm not NOAA, and I'm not a climate science or atmospheric scientist. I would just sort of note that the warming that we're experiencing today by all of our sort of federal agencies, international sort of organizations as well, is unprecedented in the last few thousand years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. In addition, our levels of CO2 are also off the charts on sort of glacial and millennial timescales. And this often comes up. There are these sort of narrow ones, which on this sort of, why are they adjusting the data or adjusting the numbers? I'm not going to pretend that I know the exact reason why they do, but I'm sure there's a scientific paper that explains why they are doing that in a clear and a coherent way. And this is often a struggle. The other sort of common one you hear is, well, what about those natural cycles and the solar cycles and the volcanic cycles? And that's been a lot of what actually this latest sixth assessment report from the IPCC dives into, that those natural cycles, our climate, if it was just all about natural sort of warming and cooling sort of trends, our temperature would actually be cooler right now. And clearly it's not. And clearly we are seeing instead, year after year, a breaking of temperature records, the overheated, the intensity of our storms that are impacted by that overheated atmosphere, the atmosphere's ability to retain more moisture, which makes storms wetter, and more water makes more damage, and so on and so forth. But I can obviously recommend to your writer the sources of NOAA's good science in support of the long-term temperature data. So I wanted to, there's some good questions. I think some of our earliest ones from Glenn asking about the subsidies for fossil fuels. And I could have done a whole slide on the fossil fuel subsidies. They are significant. And this is actually one of the things that are both at the US and around the world, we still have this inherent advantages to fossil fuel extraction. And they come in a ton of different forms. There's subsidies on the extraction sides. There's subsidies on their depreciation of their assets. There's subsidies in their tax treatments, et cetera. And those, it looks, someone else said there's $1 million per minute of fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, this is one of our main challenges of our addiction to fossil fuels and their ability, once they get those subsidies through their lobbying efforts and others, to just hold on to them forever and to fight to the death over them. And that's where I wonder, I haven't seen it yet, but so the fossil fuel lobby, if when we want to talk about what happened in the bipartisan infrastructure framework and the Build Back Better and the fights with Joe Manchin, a lot of that is from fossil fuel lobbying to keep at least the sticks, the penalties on fossil fuels out. I wonder whether the combined strength of the electric utilities, which in an electrified world where we've electrified vehicles and home heating, they are the new, gas station is now the plug in your garage, to their lobbying power, which is significant, the lobbying power of the Googles and Amazons and Facebooks, or the Fords or other auto companies that are committed to an electrified future. Some have stepped up in this sort of moment. It hasn't been as sort of, as large of a rallying cry. I mean, maybe the tech companies are also getting hammered by Washington and they're a little sort of gun shy of jumping, wading in. But I wonder where that sort of balance against the fossil fuel interests are going to come. Yeah. I see another question from Randall on geoengineering. This is one that comes up quite a bit. I think there's, I forget his last name is Keith, or his first professor, I think up at Harvard, who's been talking about seeding the atmosphere with aerosols to basically reflect the incoming sunlight to buy us some time. My short response to that is, I don't think we've done a good job in our global experiment right now. And that seems like adding another huge variable into that global experiment that I would worry significantly about unintended consequences, when I think we know the types of things that would actually work: getting off of fossil fuels, getting into electrified heating, cooling vehicles. So I'm concerned about geoengineering. I do teach, I do a class frequently for my undergrads to sort of provoke have a provocative discussion about are we desperate enough to try geoengineering? Do we get to that point? Because it could, you basically darken the sky and it would actually cool us down. You'd have to keep doing it. And as soon as you stopped doing it, all the heating would snap right back, which is again a risk. It's a risky venture when I think there are a lot more certain things that we can do on efficiency, deployment of renewables to address the climate crisis. I see a good question from Minta. Minta, you already had a question, so I will skip over you. I'm sorry. Oh, Minta, that's not fair. Congressional policy of carbon pricing. Yeah, so this was actually an interesting part in this back and forth over the Build Back Better bill, and the sort of concern that if you lost what in essence was going to be a national clean energy standard, could you replace it quickly with carbon pricing? And my personal concern comes around the fact that this is what the oil lobbies have sort of not so quietly said that they like. But I have the feeling they say they like it because people don't like taxes in general. And that's part of my experience from my time as commissioner in Connecticut, when there's was a bill to actually increase our renewable portfolio standard that we were presenting, along with a economy-wide greenhouse gas goal for the state of Connecticut. And we presented that bill to the Environment Committee, got 3 nice questions, and thank you very much, and we sat down. And right behind us was a carbon tax bill that ended up having 4 hours of people coming up, mostly against the carbon tax and railing against it, where our more under the radar screen approach didn't engender that sort of visceral reaction to taxes. And I think that will always be a challenge of taxes and tax policy. The Robert Archer has a good question about a gap in my state summary. Yes, I did not talk about the cap and trade experiences, and the challenges. Did that just go away? Sorry, I didn't. Oh, sorry, Barbara. I just wanted to read the rest of your question.
Hang on, let's see if we can get it back.
No, I found it. It's in the other. I found it. So why have we not analyzed the lack of causality in RGGI's program? So actually, there has been analysis of RGGI, and I would. RGGI, for those who don't know, is a regional greenhouse gas initiative, a cap and trade system just on the electric sector for the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states. And I think part of what Robert may be getting at is that it did establish a market for the trading of emissions credits, and the price of a ton of carbon for a long time was $2.50. It kind of went up to $5 or $7, and then it went back down. This is not a dramatic sort of impact or sort of price on carbon, like many economists would say that in order to be really effective would have to be in the $50, $75, $100 per ton. So I agree, this was not an ambitious, hard sort of cap, serious. And part of that is by design. The RGGI region is a region of a diverse set of states that needed to come together and develop their caps on the amount of emissions by consensus. And as you might guess, in consensus, you end up with what the last person was willing to hold out for. And so that did still show that you could have a market for the trading of permits to pollute. Each of the states then invested the revenues from the auction of those carbon credits in clean energy deployment, in electric vehicle deployment, in efficiency. So there was some positive benefits, but all those states did the regional greenhouse gas cap and trade system, but they also did a renewable portfolio standard, and they also did grid scale procurements of clean energy, and they're buying offshore wind. So I'm less of a fan of, well, we need one policy. One carbon tax will solve it all, or one cap and trade system. I'm much more a fan of having multiple policies that are getting at different pieces of the problem, and some may be more effective than others. So I don't disagree with you, Robert, that it didn't change and transform the entire emissions system. It also benefited, frankly, from other forces like the retirement of coal-fired power plants and the switch to natural gas. But the latest versions of the RGGI cap, which keeps going down, are actually starting to pinch a little more, and the prices of their carbon credits are going up. So to me, it's part of a portfolio approach as well. But really good question. Let me see. I'm looking. So I'm looking. There's stuff going on in the chat. There's stuff going on in the Q&A. I'm focusing mostly on the Q&A for those who are who want to get their things answered. From Damon on the Tesla battery in Vermont, and the question is that could utilities own, use, and access batteries in electric cars? Yeah, so that is part of. We're not quite there for them controlling necessarily the batteries directly, but they are. Connecticut's actually rolling out this coming year a new program where your charging of your cars will have elements of control by the utility, so they can require you to charge not at peak times from 3 to 8 p.m., charge at night. There are ideas in California to take advantage of, they've deployed a whole lot of solar, let's say in San Diego area, where they're having so much solar energy at noontime that it's too much energy. It's more than the demand for energy that's on the grid. There are thoughts that if you had a networked set of cars that could absorb that clean energy during that time, they can end up as, flattening out the sort of curves. It's called a phenomenon called the duck curve, which is because it actually looks like a duck, that you have the ability to micromanage when energy is being used, when it's being consumed, that can really optimize those renewables that are not always being produced at exactly the time you want. Batteries are kind of the key to unlocking that, and the ability to have the utility control those batteries can be a real fascinating new sort of world that we're engaged in. And utility commissions are actually embracing this as ways to reduce the need to have more transmission or more, substations, or, so this is a way through smart technology to avoid investment in traditional, then very expensive poles and wires and substations and other sorts of things. So Glenn Homan asks about offsets, and to become carbon neutral by 2030 and reclaim their historic emissions, will Microsoft have to use offsets? I think they're using offsets in part to meet their obligations. And this is a real area of interesting and debate. And not all offsets are created equal. And there have been some sort of scandals about offsets, particularly in the world of sort of protected sort of natural areas or forests that have gotten some publicity of, would that forest ever really have been cut down? Are you really an additive? Are you really saving carbon? The Nature Conservancy actually got in trouble in that regard. Microsoft's plan, though, does have a lot of actual deployment of clean energy at all their buildings and facilities, and the use of power purchase agreements. So they are buying clean energy through that is built away from their site. They're also buying virtual power purchase agreements where the energy wouldn't even be delivered into their local grid or network. It could be elsewhere. So they're going to use a combination of things, particularly to get at the emissions from the use of their products, like an Xbox or whatever. They're really trying to capture the entire life cycle of their products and the energy and carbon emissions all along the chain. It'll be interesting to see how they do it, but they're also investing in things like advanced sort of direct air capture and negative emissions to try to truly offset their emissions. Yes, so Ruth asked about community solar farms and whether an apartment dweller like her can buy into them, how they work, and is it a good thing? I think generally it is a good thing, and it is part of the recognition that solar has to be for everyone, and that everyone includes solar. I would also add, electric vehicle charging. One of our challenges are for folks who are doing things that we actually are good for the environment, of living in dense urban areas. It's a lot harder to deploy clean energy on your roof if you don't own your roof. It's also hard to deploy clean energy if you live in the forest where it's always shaded, or if you don't have property. My solar array, my roof is shaded, but I have enough land out back, and my wife was okay with me taking up part of our lawn for our ground-mounted solar array. So a community solar farm, in Vermont has been a leader here, California as well, Massachusetts, allows you to buy almost like a co-op share in a community solar grid and have the electricity produced in that one location offset a bunch of different people's electric bills. So you are either contributing by investing in that sort of development and then sharing some of the benefits in terms of getting the virtual net metering or reduction on your electric use and metering. What's also nice about it is that you can site that clean energy facility, the solar array, in the place where it makes the most sense. You can site it on degraded land or a brownfield, or you can have them now on solar canopies on parking lots. There will always be a tension, though, in solar, particularly in the Northeast, where we're densely developed, where where solar will want to be on farm fields or occasionally shut down forests or cut down forests, which is something when I was commissioner, I had two different parts of my agency fighting over each other. Why are you approving a solar array that's going to cut down this forest? And those are some of the policies at those smaller grid scale and larger grid scale, particularly in the Northeast, that we've been struggling with. But Ruth, community solar is an option in many communities, and I think it's generally a good thing, because the solar generation then just becomes an accounting exercise to make sure that you, as a member of that community solar group, get a credit back on your bill. Okay, let me see. Oh, I have someone, Arnold, asking about what Woodbridge, Connecticut, my hometown, is doing to promote the use of renewable energy in its homes and businesses. So thank you, Arnold, for that question. Woodbridge, as well as a whole bunch of communities in Connecticut, have done what are called Solarize campaigns, which is an effort by a community to come together and say, we all want to go solar as a community, and the community can go out to a developer and say to the developer, here's an opportunity to do a bunch of solar homes in one community. Will you offer advantageous pricing if we get above 5 homes or above 10 homes? And those types of campaigns both bring down the cost for the individual homeowner and create kind of a local buzz and a local sort of community sort of coming together effort. So Solarize campaigns, they've happened in Connecticut and California and Massachusetts and others, where you're kind of using the Groupon model, where you get enough people to sort of show up, you get reduced pricing for volume, and the positive parts of social media, which social media in general, it's hard to say much positive other than, I guess, like, cat and dog videos, or but that social sort of community building around clean energy. I've now seen efforts to do similar things for air source heat pumps. So a organized campaign to get you and your neighbors all going together as a group to ask for clean energy. And then I think Woodbridge also has a microgrid at our emergency operations centers and our high school, a place of resilient power with clean energy within the microgrid that it will stay up in case the larger grid goes down. So that's another thing that's happening in my hometown. Leonard Katz asks about nuclear fusion. And I appreciate the question, but I'm not a nuclear sort of physicist. I do feel a little like I've been hearing about the new next generation nuclear every 5 years for the last 20, 25 years that I've been doing this, that new nuclear is just around the corner, the small modular reactors. And there's money in the bipartisan infrastructure framework. There's R&D money constantly going into the world of new nuclear that's cleaner, that fails safe, that doesn't have the, I saw there was another comment elsewhere about Fukushima being a $250 billion disaster, kind of proving the point on that Price-Anderson sort of act that the companies get off the hook at $500 million, and then $2 billion is on the rest of on the federal government as a huge subsidy to the nuclear industry. But Leonard, I always hear about it is just around the corner, but I haven't seen it in reality yet. Glenn did remember that my Harvard professor doing solar geoengineering is David Keith, which always confuses me when people have two first names in one of them as a last name. Stuart Gardner, the hyperpolarization in Congress. Should states be encouraged to use more interstate compacts to create coherent clean energy policies and pool financial resources? Wow, really great question. And there are a number of organizations like the US Climate Alliance, like the We're Still In Coalition, like the sort of groups of mayors and cities and companies that are kind of doing just that, though not necessarily as formally as an interstate compact, though things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative are similar to that. One of the things, though, I always enjoyed as part of those organizations is that it would bring together the Climate Alliance is about 25 states plus or minus now. And as Connecticut, we would always like to participate because we would always learn something from California or from Massachusetts. Maybe from New York, although we didn't like learning anything. We had Connecticut has a bias against New York, or maybe I personally had a bias against New York. Apologies to all our folks in New York. This is, though, part of those sort of subnational coalitions where they're just trying to share best practices and figure out what works and see what's possible, with the reality of the politics are challenging also at the local level. But again, as a Connecticut, it was always great to sort of join in with a California and others who had more resources and staff resources than we did, and to join with them. Rosella Sabatina asked about nuclear power. And I'll take this question as well, because nuclear, and this is something that we dealt with here in Connecticut, I'm definitely in the camp of we have existing nuclear power, it's baseload clean energy. I recognize the challenges of nuclear waste, that we don't have a long-term solution. Here in Connecticut, we have one operating nuclear power plant, 2,000 megawatts. The largest power plant in New England is here in Connecticut. And we as a state decided that we were going to subsidize it to keep it running, because the replacement cost of replacing that zero carbon power would be astronomical. So if they did actually shut down and leave, it was worth it to keep them here with a small subsidy than the loss, because that nuclear power would be replaced by natural gas, and the loss of the carbon benefits would quickly happen. And so part of that is is existing nuclear to key, and this is actually currently being debated in California with their Diablo Canyon plant, which is scheduled to shut down. California, and some are saying you can't afford to shut down that large amount of nuclear, zero carbon nuclear power. Now, I get it. Nuclear power plants are very expensive. They're complicated. And in a post 9/11 world, they require folks with guns to guard them and secure them and to guard the waste that the waste that sits there and will sit there for 30 or 50 more years in Connecticut in 2 different locations. We have the Connecticut Yankee Power Plant on the Connecticut River near Haddam in Connecticut, has shut down decades ago, has been cleaned up to the point where you can have, housing developments and kids and parks. Is a beautiful spot on the Connecticut River that we can never redevelop, at least not for, in the next 30 or 50 years, because it is host to dry cask storage of the nuclear waste that sits there and is guarded 24/7 by people to make sure that no one messes around with it. That's not a sustainable, in the long run, but in this near term, Rosella, thanks for the question. I do agree that it is a necessary element of maintaining that sort of baseload power. Wow, the questions still keep coming. Lauren, I'm happy to keep going. You tell me when I should stop.
We have about 10 more minutes.
Great, and I have enough water to make sure my voice will keep us going. So the Stephen Browdegam with an interesting question on energy from waste and should it be considered renewable. So I can only give you our Connecticut perspective, where we actually do give our waste to energy facilities in Connecticut Class 2 renewable energy credits. So we do subsidize waste to energy in Connecticut. So for those who don't know, Connecticut got out of the landfilling business about 30, 40 years ago and shifted to incineration of our waste, which was done at the time because of environmental controls and other things and concerns about where our waste might end up and filling up of landfills and et cetera. And it has always been in this sort of strange position of whether to consider it a semi-renewable resource. And there's debate over that. And part of the challenge here is that it's, you are burning your trash. They would actually prefer to get more plastics in your waste because those burn, because they're unsurprisingly made out of petroleum, and less organics, which are wet and heavy and don't, your waste food doesn't burn very well. I'm much more interested on that note in the technology that would actually take our organic waste problems, which in Connecticut we burn it, but in many other states, if those end up in a landfill, those decompose into methane released as a greenhouse gas. There's a new world of anaerobic biodigestion that actually takes those organic wastes and turns them into a biogas that can then replace natural gas. It could be turned into a fuel. It could be injected into pipeline. It could be turned into electricity. I'm much more a fan of that type of organic waste turning into energy than the kind of mass burn our trash view. And I would more consider that organic waste to energy renewable than I would the broader waste to energy. So I do want to give just a quick sort of, I think there's been, so Sally Thurston had a question. I know I'm now jumping around a little bit. Sally Thurston had a question about geothermal heat pumps and how we rarely see them. These are generally better for home heating. Geothermal heat pumps tend to be only cost effective right now in new construction when you're starting from scratch and you've already kind of are digging up your building site anyway. They are part of the future though for institutions like Yale and Wesleyan and a whole bunch of Cornell, others who are thinking about, particularly for their campuses that already have either a steam loop and cogeneration facilities or even a thermal or hot water loop. Geothermal would be the next logical step for those types of campuses that already have the infrastructure, because it can and be part, and Europe actually does this quite a bit in sort of district heating loops. That's an opportunity right now with existing gas-fired power plants to capture the waste heat so for Yale's example, Stirling and the power plant by the gym generate electricity for Yale's campus, but also waste heat. That waste heat moves around campus and heats the buildings. And in the summer, it's used to condense and chillers. And so it brings air conditioning as well. So the next generation of that will be a geothermal heat pump that is taking that constant 55-degree temperature of the ground, 6 feet or so below the ground, and using that as a heat exchange medium. So I do think there's a future there, but it will be likely for larger sort of institutions, campuses, cities, or new construction. But those are some of the things that are actually in this world of the bipartisan infrastructure framework and the Build Back Better. And I think there's going to be a real sort of challenge there if we don't get those last pieces together on investments in significant investments that are particularly in the Build Back Better piece. There's been some analysis that the bipartisan infrastructure framework does have money for electric vehicle charging and public transit and some updates to the electric grid, but the deep decarbonization is actually in the Build Back Better, the one that needs to go through budget reconciliation with over $550 billion in climate-related spending, which would be the most significant investment in climate ever for the US if it passes. That's a very big if. But those are part of the most important pieces. And frankly, the options without it, even with it, are still challenging to meet that sort of 50% reductions by 2030. All righty, let me see other questions. Oh, Ann Peterson, I know Ann, hi Ann, asks about improving and streamlining the permitting processes for renewable energy sources. So this is something we talk quite a bit about in my environmental law and policy class and others about the challenges of siting of clean energy, because it does run up against that classic not in my backyard challenge that we have. And we're seeing it even in offshore wind, we see it in transmission lines. And those are always going to be, those are going to continue to be challenging. And right now, much of our challenge at the national level is that we have windy and sunny areas that aren't where most of the load is. And you're going to need to build that transmission infrastructure to move it from the windy and sunny places and really upgrade our grid to really meet the challenge. And I'll apologize for giving a shout out to folks at Princeton, but Princeton has done a real sort of in-depth analysis of all the new transmission it would take to get there. And it is $1 trillion worth of transmission that all needs to be put somewhere. And FERC currently does not have the authority to basically override those siting decisions. You end up in this sort of large scale transmission siting. You get very parochial and local sort of fights over, well, it has to come through my jurisdiction and I don't think I'm going to say yes. And then it has to go to the next jurisdiction and there isn't the ability, unlike in natural gas infrastructure, natural gas pipeline infrastructure, where the FERC actually has the authority to kind of override local siting. That is controversial, and it sort of goes contrary to a lot of our cooperative federalism structures where the federal government wants to work with the states. This may be one of those instances where the federal government actually needs the authority to overrule those sort of local decisions in some instances if you really want to get that bulk power grid really up to the task that's ahead of it. I'm now looking at a few more questions. So Keith Flavel, at the end of the day, how do you motivate states or countries to buy into clean energy if their economy depends on fossil fuel extraction? Keith, that's a great question and probably a good and a challenging one to end on. It's something that I actually had a couple of students working on over this summer on this question of what a just transition looks like. So this transition to clean energy, there will be winners and losers. And the winners won't always be in the same places where the losers were. And much of this is and we see this already with the challenges that the Biden administration is having, trying to get any sort of sticks, any sort of, anything that recognizes that fossil fuels are part of the problem. But if you could even get beyond that, which is a big if, what about those communities that are dependent? What happens when that anchor of that community, the coal-fired power plant or the mine, goes away? What is left behind? Much of our recent history has not been good in this regard. It has been to basically say, yeah, you're on your own, good luck. And that then leads to the unfortunate the increase in sort of diseases of despair, the sort of depressed economies in the former coal mining communities. So we kind of have the example of what not to do. How do you actually build into this transition enough resources and investment in making that transition fair and just? That raises a bunch of questions of, well, fair and just for who? Is it fair and just for the workers who are now out of a job? Yes, that's definitely a part of it. For the towns that have now lost not only their big sort of tax base, the big company that's gone away, but all those workers that were in the restaurants and in the community and part of the the fabric of that community. So yes, that's another group that you need to recognize that needs assistance in that transition. But there are also potentially the folks who live next to or are on the fence line of those dirty energy facilities, environmental justice communities who have actually may have rallied to say, we want this dirty power plant to go away because we have to live next to it every day and we're breathing the air that it is producing. And some answers to this question may support one group or not the other. What we've seen though, and some of my students this summer did some really interesting research, where it works is where, first of all, you recognize all of those important key stakeholders, you engage them in a process before the thing goes away. It's always harder, much harder to do this once it's gone and shuttered and you're now dealing with sort of crisis management. Can you be thoughtful ahead of time? Colorado has developed a just transition office. Colorado is a relatively large oil and gas and coal producing state, and they recognize that their clean energy and climate policies are contrary to the things that are part of their sort of fossil economy. So they have stood up an organization to try to bring together all those stakeholders, and they're starting to actually put money and investment into those processes. And it's bringing together community organizers, representatives of labor, representatives of the industry themselves as well. Some of the utility commissions are trying to figure out, okay, can we figure out in the winding down of that power plant a way to support the community through the amortization and the sort of securitization actually of that wind down of the company? Is there money there to invest in the community? So some states are experimenting with that. But Keith, it's going to be one of those hard questions. And if recent history is, we haven't shown ourselves to be good at this yet, but it is something that we will hopefully be part of that conversation that you need, and not merely with some hand waving of we'll do some job training or whatnot, but that there needs to be meaningful investment in those communities that are otherwise going to be left behind from the new clean energy economy. And we're seeing some positive signs of that. I don't want to end on such a down note, Lauren, because my students often make fun of me that I'm like the Debbie Downer of.
Well, I think that the positive note is that for those of you who've been following along in the chat, there's been quite a dynamic conversation. So many resources shared. So obviously, Rob, you have sparked a lot of ideas and exchange and sort of dynamic and passionate conversation, which is exactly what this series is meant to do. And that's a positive. And if anything's going to be done about climate change, it requires engagement at all of the levels that you've described, state, local, and federal. And I think with this group that we've had here today, not only have we a lot of ideas about engagement, but we have the kind of community that can make a difference. So that's the positive note. I think you contributed a ton to our alumni community with this lecture. Thank you so much. I want to also just re-emphasize that for people who want more of this kind of education, the Yale Certificate Program in Financing and Deploying Clean Energy is accessible and available to you. You don't have to be enrolled in Yale to enroll in that program. So please do check it out on the Yale School of the Environment website. And I want to thank Rob for joining us today for an excellent and dense, thorough lecture. I hope that you will come back. I could see that you would be a great instructor for a Yale Alumni Academy course, so maybe we'll be able to do that at some point in the future. Any final comment you would like to make, Rob, as we close?
No, other than so excited that I could do this, and such a wonderful set of chat. I did just get to scroll through the chat now, and as I've always seen in these instances, such great interaction amongst the participants as well. I'm sorry to those that I didn't get to all of your questions, but I think I got to a bunch of them. And they were wonderful questions and a real treat for me. So Lauren, thank you for inviting me. This was a whole lot of fun.
Okay, wonderful. Well, a lot of people are asking about the chat. We will be saving this presentation, a video presentation. The slides will also be available on the Yale Alumni Academy website. And we will post the content of the chat as well. So for those of you who missed earlier parts, you can see the chat by visiting our website a couple of days from now. Give us time to get it up. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors at Harvard Alumni Travels for co-sponsoring this climate change conversation series. And I will see you at the next one tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.